Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sarah Smucker-Barnwell, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Trust Board of Trustees. I'm glad that you're able to join us today for today's telehealth community chat, Telepsychology Etiquette, Infusing Ethical Digital Engagement with Sound Clinical Rapport. As a trust policyholder, we hope you're familiar with our telehealth community chats. I'm pleased to once again be joined by Dr. Margot Adams-Larson. So without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, hello, Sarah. I'm so excited to have another chat with you, and we're changing things up a little this time. So, as a reminder, this really is a discussion of practical how-to information from an ethical perspective related to topics in telepsychology. And as Sarah mentioned, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box so we can be reviewing those as we're chatting today. And, if yours doesn't get answered today, we promise we look through these and bring the information into future chats as well. You can also email us at telehealthcommunity@trustinsurance.com. As Sarah also mentioned, within your email, you should find a copy of the slides or kind of the bullet point content information that we'll be presenting today and the acronyms. So you don't have to worry about writing those down now. They will be available to you, or you may have already printed those out. So without further ado, let's chat a little bit, Sarah, about our new format.
Right. So we have a little bit of a shift today. So you may have noticed if you've come to another chat in the past, it didn't have such a snazzy title, and today we do, about telepsychology etiquette. And I think, part of our goal in bringing a little bit more focus to some of the themes we'll be speaking about in future telehealth chats is helping to be, expanding our community. We have this amazing telehealth community. And one thing we've been talking about, Margot and I, as well as folks at the Trust, is talking about this kind of amazing diversity that we see in the folks who attend. Folks who have been doing this a long time, they are seasoned practitioners who carry with them tremendous clinical wisdom and really a longitudinal perspective on the profession. And folks who are new to the profession, maybe they've only ever come up in a telehealth sort of a telehealth centric phase of their career, and the diversity of the questions and themes that they bring. I think there is this amazing opportunity for us to gather around themes that are relevant to all of us across the sort of lifespan of our professional careers, and to bring those strengths together. So I think one of the goals we have is talking about some of the harder issues that telepsychology clinicians face, just those nuanced technological and clinical factors. And our hope is that, we gain both the wisdom of folks who've been doing this a long, long time, the enthusiasm of folks who are new and have fresh perspective. And so we really just invite you and your colleagues to bring your questions, your thoughts, bring the hard questions. We're interested in those. And I don't know, I'm really excited to capture people's perspectives today as we talk about kind of this new facet of clinical skills, like how do you maintain rapport and boundaries in the context of a telepsychology rich clinical environment.
I love that. And I would also invite folks to invite their colleagues who haven't come. And maybe it's some of those younger colleagues. We're really focusing on some different types of demonstrations. And one of the things that I think we've really tried to cultivate in our expression today is guiding folks through real life experiences. And I really want to invite those of you viewing this to come along on a journey with me in the conversation with Sarah, and really to delve into some of those clinical skill sets that are a little bit harder maybe to focus on. And you know, as I'm experiencing our conversation today, I'm noticing that Sarah is engaging in a few things that maybe we could just pull up our poll first to see what others are noticing.
Well, Margot, they say feedback is a gift. And, I think we pulled some examples today to just talk a little bit about like, well, what happens in our sessions? Like, how do we know we're losing our client? How do we know something is amiss, even though nothing's being stated? How do we feel that our clinical engagement is going off the rails a bit? And more importantly, what do we do in these moments? Because especially in a telehealth environment where the environment is, less controlled, we just see more of these behaviors emerging. And how do we want to respond to that in a way that is aligned with our clinical orientation, respectful of our clients, but also addressing the elephant in the room?
So I'm curious, as we close that poll down, what we're seeing folks noticing. And for those of you who may be listening in on demand, we are noticing things like Sarah was looking at her phone. Maybe there was some loud noises happening. Some light was shifting on her face. And she even moved out of view of the video. And so these are all things that I think happen to us when we're on video sessions with clients. They happen when we're maybe in session and drop something on the floor or experience something out of the ordinary on our side. And I think one of the things that tends to be really challenging is how to address that. And, when it happens once, maybe that's a little different than if it happens routinely. But we wanted to emphasize this today because, usually Sarah and I are very engaged in the camera. Sometimes we're looking down maybe at notes or at the Q&A, but in general, we're pretty engaged with the camera. And I felt like this would be a great example for folks who've been here before to really experience something different in what our engagement is in this conversation. And so I'm really curious how we could pull up poll number two, how if this was happening in session, how you might be feeling as the provider in that session. What might truly be crossing your mind or crossing your emotional experience, and how does it make you feel when that person is engaged in these other things, when they're maybe looking away, they're out of screen, they're, clearly focused on something very different. How are you experiencing that as the provider in that session? And we'll leave the poll open for just a couple more moments for people to vote. I'm really curious how this will be coming across.
Margot, I know in our conversations, we talked a lot about like the value of acknowledging that in real time. So much of our clinical relationships with clients have to do with that ebb and flow, that give and take. And we have this whole new vector in our relationships. There's a whole new in telepsychology relationships, there is this new facet of interaction, this new facet of distraction potentially. And what that means for our relationships, not just with our clients' experience of us, but our experience of them,
Exactly.
our transference and countertransference.
So as we close that poll, I'm really curious to see what we find in how others experience that time. And
A
so the
kind
question,
group.
yes, the question
Aw.
was if this was your session with Sarah, how would you be feeling as the provider and with those distractors? And I think the majority said confident, I can kindly address this. Some folks were feeling ignored. Others were feeling uncomfortable. A few people said, well, this is kind of normal stuff, no change, it's kind of
Yeah.
typical. Um, and a smaller group were really excited by it because there was something maybe that they could engage in and work on within that session time. And so that's a great segue into kind of my response to how you were distracted and involved in other things. And I'm really curious, Sarah, if there is maybe something that was taking your focus away as we were starting our telehealth chat today, or I noticed you were looking at your monitor maybe or typing something, and it's super different from our past telehealth chats and sessions. And so I'm just curious if maybe this is a good time, or if there's something else that you might need or we might need to address in this moment.
I love this, Margot, because it meets the question, head on. You're candid, you're warm, you're kind, you're not judging or shaming me, and you're clinically interested, right? Like maybe I'm over here looking at notes because I'm worried about the next upcoming telehealth community chat. Maybe I'm anxious about something, maybe I'm distressed, maybe I'm exhausted from some other thing in my life. You know, showing up with curiosity, which is what we as psychologists do all the time in our clinical sessions, and just understanding this new facet, this new dynamic of our interactions and what it means for our rapport and our engagement. So I think this is a really important sort of timely topic and ties in really nicely to our first topic because all of this is so intersectional with provider fatigue, the idea of like being cognizant of the impacts that these experiences have on us and what it means and how we can take care of ourselves with really being thoughtful about what are those micro skills that help us maintain engagement? How do we address what's going on clinically, and not feel kind of worn down and fatigued by these kind of micro things that happen along the way?
Before we jump into that, I'd love to pull up our poll three and just hear a little bit about what all of you are typically responding to these kinds of things
Yeah.
within your session. And if you choose to, how might you approach these types of behaviors that you're observing that maybe seem a bit off or are in the way, or you're experiencing as uncomfortable as the provider there? So we've got poll number three up, and we'll leave it up for just another few moments. But I'm really curious because I feel like this is one of the things that we can often take away from session and still wonder, did we engage, well with that? Do we need to set some different boundaries with that, perhaps? And that'll be our next topic today is some of those digital boundaries. And we can close the poll and see what our community will do. So the question was, how might you approach this in your session? And overall majority are kindly identifying these observations, which I so appreciate that. A few are suggesting the patient attend to the need and then return to session quickly, which super real life things happen. And a smaller percentage say they'll ignore these behaviors. And, I think all of these are great answers because there is a time and place for things, and having some grace and giving our patients and ourselves some grace in terms of things that happen. And what I would say is if this becomes habit, these are perhaps things that you'll share a little bit more about in terms of those micro skills. But those are things that I'm looking for in observations, is those observations over time and how we can mitigate those. So hopefully that covers and gets us into our topics for today.
Great. I really like this topic because I think this is something that's definitely happening in my clinical practice. I believe in many of our clinical practices. And thinking about how we want to greet these moments in some ways in practical everyday ways. And we're going to speak first about like what are the things, that we can think about that are just practical everyday things. Some addressed with technology, some with just, intention. And then I want to dig a little deeper, like, so what does it all mean? What does it all mean for our clinical relationships? I don't know that I have the total answer for that, but I think it's an interesting question to pose. To me, this is a newer area of clinical training. And back in the day, when I used to have postdocs at the Telehealth and Rural Outreach Fellowship, we would spend our first day recording ourselves, in telehealth environments. And I was always really struck by the discrepancies. Some of the warmest, kindest, loveliest people in person read so differently in a
Mm.
virtual context. And I thought that was really interesting and spoke to me to the necessity of thinking of how to translate some of our clinical skills into different contexts, video conferencing being one. But I'm speaking about a telephone as well, where we have no benefit, of the visual, or even in some of our asynchronous communication. I
Mhm.
know a lot of times I can be rushed and hurried. How do I make sure I'm showing up in a way that is right-sized in terms of the engagement I'm offering and the information I'm communicating?
So
So
not
just
all caps.
yeah, shouty capitals. Yes, exactly. That's terse, shouty capitals. That's my goal. All right, so what are some of the practical things? I mean, there's some old school things we've probably been talking about since chat number one, but I'd be remiss not to say them. Things like eye contact. Where this is today is so much better than where it was a decade ago.
So true.
Right? So now we have cameras that really solve for this problem. It used to be you felt like you were staring off into the ether, with your video conferencing camera, always askew and in an awkward angle. I think these days we have a lot more options. I rather like the cameras that look like the fish that come, from the dark deeps of the ocean that hang actually perfectly in your line of sight. But there's so many good ones out there. So I think technology choices can help address this. But the idea that at many times I might not appear to be looking someone in the eye, making sure that my setup for video conferencing, if that's what I choose to do, is optimized for that. And so to know that, I'm going to have to do some tests. I'm going to have to really look in the self view. I'm going to have to, help others that I'm teaching learn how to do that as well. I think there's something to be said about lighting. And I hate to say it, but if we're doing a lot of telepsychology, I think there's something to be said about investing in the lighting that makes us appear, our usual fleshy colors, that makes us look our normal selves and it doesn't distract to take away. These are investments. And, if you did 1 hour of telepsychology a month, well, I don't know that it's as worthwhile than if you're doing 5 hours a day. Perhaps the most important thing in my mind is the role of verbal empathy. We lose all the physicality of our clinical rapport. When we are in person, I know I was trained to show up physically in a certain way, to lean towards someone when they say something difficult, to be really cognizant of what they're communicating to me with their body language, mirror it, or at least acknowledge it if I think it's clinically interesting. I was trained in trauma therapy where you sit so close to someone, you're practically touching knees. These obviously are conditions I'm not going to replicate in a video conferencing or telephone environment. And so, in my way of thinking, and this, supported by good clinical literature, we slow it down. We focus on verbal empathy, and maybe we're a little more obvious than we would be in other circumstances. If I feel sad about some of the things someone's telling me, and I might normally show up physically demonstrating that care, I may need to explicitly say, like, what you're sharing with me, I feel really sad about it. It's very on the nose, but I think there's tremendous value to erring on the side of overstating than presuming we are understood. We ask lots of questions. When you come into my office and um, I can observe your gait. I can see you walk in. Now, I might still ask some things about how steady do you feel on your feet, depending on the nature of the clinical question or the work I do. But if I don't have that, well, I may need to specifically ask some questions. I may need to ask some questions that are a little strange. Like sometimes if someone comes in, I can get a better sense of are they taking care? Do they seem to have showered and brushed their hair, brushed their teeth? It's harder to know in a video conferencing context, a telephone context. Olfactory data is clinical data. I may need to ask some explicit questions about how able are you to take care of yourself these days? I want to slow down and use more reflective summaries to double check that we're on track, I'm understanding. And again, I tend to be a little shameless about this. I err on the side of saying, at this moment, I just want to check in to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. I try not to take anything for granted because I realize I am missing certain data that I would capture in an in-person environment or an environment with visual data, so forth. So I think an example might be if a client's looking down, this happens to me all the time actually. If a client's looking down and they're sighing, are they distressed? Are they processing something? Are they not wanting to look at me and make the eye contact? Are they looking at their phone and they're stressing out because they just got an email? Both are actually clinically interesting, both have relevance for us, but boy, they're really different. And I can't assume. And, I think there's a natural politesse where people want to not bring up the thing, but I think it is our clinical imperative to pause, acknowledge, like, oh gosh, I notice you're looking down. I see you're sighing. I want to bring curiosity to what's happening. These types of explicit verbal check-ins invite us in to the client's experience, and so we can know what we know in the moment. Having just said to slow it way down, I'm also going to offer the counterbalance of pacing. So I find that clients may struggle a little bit more in virtual environments to keep on the time of a session than if we are sitting together. There's something about that clock and looking together in the clock when I was trained that it was right there. Most clinicians' office have a couple clocks. And that shared context, when my client glances at the clock, I know they've glanced at the clock. I look at it too. And we're having a little bit of conversation about that without having conversation. That is not happening virtually. So I find that keeping the time, first of all, very crisp and being thoughtful about those boundaries, because sometimes we're seeing people in their home, we're just helping them hold the framework that this is a medical appointment. um, be really explicit. So again, I tend to err on the side of being very verbal about this because we're not having that shared reference to the clock that I will often say, not unlike I do it, when I'm managing like my family, hey, we have about 10 minutes left. We have about 5 minutes left. Sometimes if someone doesn't like this, we'll check in on this. But I do like to benchmark. We're starting to wrap up. And there might be physical cues I would share about that in person that are just going to get missed in another environment. And so I'm going to be pretty darn explicit of saying we're winding down, we're closing up our themes, we're thinking about next appointment and homework. And in doing that, I think it provides a container, to kind of keep us on our paces. I
Sarah,
often
I
make the
just want to
joke,
say this
please.
is all good stuff for our in-person sessions too, right? There's some of
Right.
these components that we really can value and benefit to bring back into the office as well. But I love these ideas.
It's a great point. I mean, this is like these are psychologist things. Like, right, these are the things we know to do as a psychologist. I'll share with you in the context of the pandemic where I went fully virtual, and remained so. I realized how much I needed to get back to basics, return to fundamentals, and be like, oh, right, like, it's all my clients now, and some respond really favorably, and some need a little bit more guidance and structure to keep the paces. Um, I make the joke, Margot. I know we joke that like technology choices are clinical choices. So sometimes, thinking about like what helps us have rapport, what helps us, what technology facilitates the type of interaction we want to have. An example I like to use is whiteboards. It's kind of a goofy one, but I really think there's something about jotting down what someone's telling me if they're trying to create a systems like for example, when I do a genealogram of someone's family, I think there's something powerful about writing it down. I used to do it in person when we were together. I like a technology that lets me do it and represent it visually as I speak with someone. It's a personal choice. For me, I find that's rapport building. Other people may say, nah, I don't like that, and that's fine. But again, what are the technologies that support how I like to connect? So these are all some practical things. I think they're valuable for us to think about, those first principles, but I'm also really interested in the idea, and I feel like a lot of today is talking about like, what does this all mean clinically? And Margot, a thing I really liked that you did in the vignette was acknowledging, let's be real when things start to go off the rail. And I'm curious, what was that like for you to bring it up to me? Obviously, we knew it was coming, but
Well, I think it's my natural tendency to be curious about
yeah.
things. And like I said, I mean, obviously we knew we were doing this, but it's it was so off from what your typical
Mhm. I hope
kind
so.
of patterns are, right, in our communication that it was pretty easy to be curious and wonder, is there something else that is going on or that we could maybe spend a focus on just to address that?
I really appreciate in that moment the notion of suspending our own potential discomfort or like, yeah, it's a little weird to bring up something. But there was no shaming in it. There was no reprisal. A thing I observe is we are all living in this attention economy. There are so
Mhm.
many competitors for our attention. And I just want to pause and recognize the normalcy. No one else in other facets of life are maintaining these boundaries perfectly. I observe phones are out where they ought not to be, during dinner, during socialization, ought not listen to my judgment. Um, work doesn't always stay boundaried to work times, the family request doesn't always stay boundaried to certain hours. It's just life. And now we have the technology to enable so much contact with one another, which is amazing in some ways and really tough in others. So
And
I
we're
like
feeling
this
less
idea.
connected.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
And we're feeling less connected. But,
Right, right.
the doctor's offices have signs that say, turn the cell phones off, put them
With cause.
away. And we don't benefit from that necessarily in our virtual office. And so I think, we'll talk more about that in our second topic, but having conversations with patients about this is truly a benefit to enriching the session as well as honoring where folks are when they're showing up.
I agree. And normalizing the struggle. We're managing, as clinicians, we're managing these boundaries too. This is relatable. Our clients are doing it. And righting the ship when it starts to go wrong, whether it's someone else in the space with our clients, I know is a common theme that's come up in my clinical life, whether it's the changing norms, of what it is to attend to one task and not be slacking work and not be checking your phone. Um, in some ways, this is an easy-ish fix to have an explicit conversation around like, well, what are your expectations? And to really have this discourse with the client. In other ways, it can be really challenging because they may come back and say, well, I don't want that. I don't think that is an appropriate boundary. And okay, to a certain extent, but as a HIPAA covered entity, I may have a perspective on that. So what does it mean when a client's preferences come up to my duty to maintain privacy, confidentiality, and so forth, even when they're willing to give their informed consent to do otherwise? So I think that as we are kind of navigating the shift in cultural norms in the clinical room, we're having this explicit discussion without shaming. And I think there's also a clinical lens to bring to this. Like, is this truly just a reaction to changing societal norms? Is this my client's avoidance of clinical contact or a preoccupation that is in the room? Are they struggling to stay present, with a difficult conversation? Or are they bored and just disengaged with me and they're just not that into me? Like, all of these are salient clinical questions. And I think offering this frame for clients, both to talk about what are our normed expectations and can we come to an accord? Like, what does this mean when this happens? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? And again, this takes me back to fundamentals of therapy and fundamentals of informed consent. Like, what did we agree that we're doing here? And I don't mean that in a challenging, mean way, but like my goal is to be helpful to the client, and we need to be in alignment, and we need to find a way, to show up for one another that feels right to the client and feels right to me, so I can do my best work. And I just want to end on the note of self-compassion. This is hard, so I think we're talking about it in the context of clients, but providers too. I don't know about the folks on this chat, but there have been days that I'm waiting for a phone call or stressing about something in my personal life, and what a tempestuous devil it is to check the technology and to try to sneak something in between sessions, or you see the phone go off in the periphery of your vision and it's something you need to know. And I think we all have to find our ways to like to manage that constant competitor for our attention, to be emotionally present, to be, ethically present, but to have self-compassion. We're all in this boat together and figuring it out. But in acknowledging this as a clinical issue, I think it's a nice lens, to bring to what's going on.
That's such a powerful statement that there's so much competing for all of our attention, and the process of therapy is meant to really suspend some of that while we're really doing the deep work. And it is more and more of a challenge, I think, that providers find in structuring that boundary, because the norm is such a pull for folks to expect how they
Hmm.
interact with us would be the same as how they interact with their workmates over, the web, or a video conferencing time, or, how they might even have experienced a medical brief appointment time in video conferencing. So, I think these are all really important things to consider, and consider with each different patient as they're coming in to sessions. We've had a number of really interesting
That
questions.
too. I saw one that I really liked that was a really good practical one because I've had the same issue.
Okay.
And one person wrote in my case, with a camera that is in the middle of a 32-inch monitor, looking someone in the eye requires me to look the camera in the eye. And just the challenge of that, and saying that, that when, you're dealing with a camera that is offset at the top of the monitor, uh, it creates discrepancy. And in the early days, I remember I was often like looking up at the camera to give the appearance of looking in the eye. And
Mhm.
for some people, they actually choose smaller monitors for this reason. I have a few colleagues I work with who have a dual monitor system, and when they are doing clinical work, they actually elect to use a smaller monitor because the discrepancy is smaller. There are some snazzy cameras now that actually do hang over into the line of sight. They they can get knocked pretty easily, and then it's a little nauseating. But we do have solutions for this. But it's a great point that if you have, a single monitor and it's a larger one, you may need to be thoughtful about like where that gaze goes to maintain that appearance of engagement. But then, of course, when I do that, I'm missing actually looking at the patient. So, it's a little bit of six of one, half dozen the other.
And I think sometimes too, it's helpful to just have that conversation even
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
your patient. I used to put eyes on the top of my cameras to remind me where to look. I think, we all have little t tips and tricks for that. Some people put their cameras actually on a tripod right in front of their video. So, there's tools or ways you can tool your current devices so you don't have to do extra spends, but it really is worthwhile kind of keeping up with what's coming out to figure out what might work better for each patient.
Should we do one more question and then move on?
Yes, absolutely.
I saw a good one. It says, what to document when patients want to do sessions from their cars or offices, typically because
Mm,
they don't have privacy in their residences or urgently desire to check in on a recent stressor. Such places afford some privacy, but they also require their situational awareness. I mean, it's one of those great ones where I feel like the answer is in the question. Um,
mhm.
it's a great point that we are a lot of times negotiating. And I know in the pandemic, boy, I saw some folks in some creative places. Um, I think, in the question itself, they're so right-minded. It's like, can the environment offer privacy and safety? I don't want to speak to someone in a moving car. I don't want to speak to someone in a potentially dangerous circumstance. Do we have informed consent? Do they understand, that if they are in this environment, it could be an impediment. They could be seen, they could be overheard, more so than in an interior office, for example. If they're in an office, like a professional office, whose Wi-Fi is it and who potentially could see that? So, I mean, these are all types of things. We're giving a little, we're taking a little, and I would want to know how busy is someone, if they're parked somewhere, is it a super busy place? Are we worried that they're having to monitor what's going on? Can they be present? Because this topic today is about clinical engagement. Like, does this help them be present and is it safe? And do they understand the risks? If so, I'm in favor. If it can't meet those criteria, then I have more concerns.
And I think that engagement is really the key and sometimes difficult, especially with your first couple sessions to really get a good read over the video conferencing for some of that engagement. And I think, you know, it is individual patient by individual patient in terms of what situations that might be appropriate for or not. And I certainly agree. I would also say the car should not be moving for a multitude of reasons. But and I bring that up because I've been there as the therapist trying to figure out how to very curiously address the moving vehicle or the moving display behind yeah. So, um, there was one other comment, Sarah, that I wanted to bring up, and this person said their telehealth program or platform allows them to hide self-view, and so that helps their patients not be distracted by seeing themselves speak. And I can think of a number of reasons why that might be quite helpful. And some may prefer that or not, but I just wanted to mention that because I think that is another kind of container that might be really helpful as a tool.
The only time I give my clients guff about it, I'll share, is if we're doing social anxiety work, which I don't love. I've spoken about before. I don't love in a telehealth context at times. Depends on the client, the circumstance.
Yeah.
But sometimes, if we're talking about communication training, if we're talking about social anxiety, about speaking, sometimes I do think it becomes a clinical tool. But if it's really not the clinical issue and they just want to turn it off, and it helps them be engaged, I love it.
Yes. So. Well, should we move on to our
Let's.
secondary topic? So, this topic is about the digital boundaries and really, navigating this digital aspect in terms of our new digital world, right? And we've got a lot of ways that we might come across or that patients might come in contact with us in the digital realm. And I think we've had, this idea of setting boundaries around time and around sessions in a virtual realm, but there are other contexts and other um, expressions of our presence in that digital world. And I think it's really about being very intentional. It's about being knowledgeable about where your presence might be or how you might run into a patient's presence in that digital world. It's about thinking about the rules that you want to establish for your practice in terms of your use of technology and how you engage online with clients and family members. It's, there's components of this that are meant to really protect a client's mental health and their privacy and their time. Equally, there are components that should protect your privacy and your self-care and your time as the provider. And thinking through, how much screen time are you having as a provider in your day? Now that we're working online all the time, that's a dramatic increase from when we were just, using our computers to have notes in between sessions with people in the office. We've got competing factors of our social media usage, and maybe that is for work and practice purposes, but it may also be for personal engagement, and also the amount of time we spend within this digital realm and thinking through our stress levels, our anxiety levels, protecting our time in terms of our rejuvenation or reducing our burnout and how we might even access colleagues to talk through situations. It's less likely to be in person these days because we have an easier access to, have a quick call between sessions or a video conference between sessions. And so I raise this as not having a ton of answers necessarily, but to really bring up important questions to take away from today's telehealth chat to really think through where have you defined your boundaries or have you? What is your value and kind of timeline or schedule around your time in the digital world? And how do you communicate that with your colleagues, with your patients, with your family members, with whoever else you might be connecting with out there in digital land? And how do you honor that for yourself? It's super important to make sure we're structuring our time. And I know we have one question that came up when you were talking, Sarah, about time management with clients in the digital, telehealth platform. And, you know, this used to be a question of how do you do time management in person? And it's no different, really, because it's just easier to kind of slide into oh, I just click off and we're done and I can go to my next session. Um, there might be people waiting, there might not be people waiting, but having that structure around your schedule, your hours that you see people, what your time is in each session and your availability, super important to communicate that. And the more you communicate that, the easier it will be for others to, first off, know what it is, and second off, not challenge you as much or just kind of slide over the time limit because you've communicated what your expectation is for that. Sarah, I love what you said with that marker of we've got about 10 minutes left now. Like, great guide. We can't change the clocks anymore and have them set for 5 minutes early.
Were we doing
Um,
that?
but we really want to think about, all of these aspects of kind of
Yeah.
what happens within our practice now that it's more digital and the ethical standards around those things. This is going to vary by who you see, their age, their generation, their experience in social digital formats. We've got a generation of now early career psychologists who, they've been in grad school through COVID and this is all they know. And so, it's going to be different for them compared to us. And yet the guidelines are still going to be fairly similar. We have to articulate for ourselves what those boundaries are, and then we have to articulate that to others so that they know what they are, so we can easily uphold those in terms of just talking about it.
And I think that discourse is the thing, right? Because especially in any time of transition and change, it's going to settle somewhere in between. Norms are changing. The generations who will write the future policies are changing. And so I think we're in this moment where culture always moves faster than professional regulation, as it should. I'm not arguing for otherwise, but it is this moment of like figuring out where is the line to maintain, and where can we accommodate, and where is it not appropriate to.
And I think it comes in with a lot of social media. The more we're using as providers, the more, you know, folks as clients are using it. And, does that constitute a relationship? And do we want to go there if they friend us? And what are our boundaries about texting outside of session to our perhaps private phone versus our social or our electronic health platform? And again, the onus really is on us as providers to set the guidelines because ultimately we're ethically responsible for that. But we're also the ones who are structuring and responsible for the professional structure of sessions. And that's not to say that you can't bend and can't flex, but it is really important to recognize we're the ones to guide that as
Mhm.
opposed to letting the client or patient or family members guide that.
I was thinking about your comments in social media, Margot, and in 2010, when I started seeing clients more meaningfully like online,
Hmm.
my counsel was, well, just don't do social media or just do it minimally or change your name and just have no presence. And like, I still think that's a valid approach. And in fact, I saw a great question about it in the chat. Uh, I think that's an absolutely valid and good work if you can get it. Um, I work in a community now that is so tech forward that if you don't have some professional identity online, I've had people say like, oh, I don't like when someone doesn't have a LinkedIn. It's like, huh, or a Psychology Today or something like that. So what's the line? Do I have a presence, but do I, I personally, I'll share I have a presence, but I hold the line on I don't make connections because I feel like there could be accidental disclosure or, I'm getting into a relationship that it's an asymmetrical power circumstance and they may not understand, that they could disclose something about their healthcare. But I think each of us is negotiating this and figuring out in an ethics informed way, where is the line, for engaging with these new modalities that blur the boundaries.
And nobody has a yellow pages anymore, I don't think. Uh, that's where we used to have our advertisements, right? And so if we don't have an online presence of a web page or a LinkedIn, I mean, it makes sense. That's where people go to look for their recommendations and to look for providers. Yet, it's an easy line to blur. And equally easy is Googling and looking up clients once, maybe they made a reference to something that was really interesting or their name seemed familiar. And, I think it's really important to recognize there are digital footprints all over the place that are very difficult to understand. LinkedIn is perhaps one of the easiest ones because they make it known that they will tell whoever you're looking at that you've
You're looking
looked
at
at their profile. Facebook, Instagram, some of the other, social media platforms, not so much. And you may or may not recognize that kind of search for client specific name and or address even, maybe leaving a footprint that you don't intend. And I'd caution folks to think about what are you going to do with the information that you find. You're now going to have some perhaps interesting information that may bias or change your perspective of a patient that they have not shared with you. And I had a really profound learning experience, not mine, but of a physician colleague who had a strange phone number on his pager and wasn't sure if he should call it back and Googled it. And it was indeed one of his patient's moms, but it was also um, her exotic service phone number line. And so now he had this information and, what do you do with that when the patient comes in next. So again, it's important to understand where you land with this, but also to have some policies, have some guidance, have some boundaries that you document and share and let your patients know, you know, where you land with that. I think also thinking about how easy it is to maybe be misunderstanding or provided information that seems real over the internet that may not be. And I say internet broadly because it's coming at us in all forms now. It's not just social media, but you know, whatever research link you're Googling may not have as accurate information. And so, um, really kind of setting the stage for these conversations with patients about, you know, honesty in terms of that interaction and being engaged in session and sharing that information with you and you doing the same.
It's beautifully said. I mean, and I think I like the point that we want to make these decisions before. Like we want to have a policy before. The thing I never want to do is get caught wrong-footed and be like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, I've given this a little bit of thought before about how I want to greet a moment like this. I may not have the exact answer, but a guiding principle.
And, you know, documenting it. Where are they? Where did they say they are? You can't, you're not a super sleuth. We're not, you know, also dually licensed usually in PI work. So, you know, we do our best to document what they tell us, and go forth from there. The whole basis of our relationships are based on honesty, right? And to do our best work, we have to receive our clients' best information from how they perceive it at the time. So, from a risk management standpoint, I'll kind of wrap this up with, you know, making sure that we're being really responsible with our ethical obligations to structure those boundaries, to be kind about that, to, you know, be in communication and expression about that, and really recognizing ultimately it will come back onto us in terms of guiding those boundaries and guiding that structure.
I think it's a great point. Um, and I like the idea that like, we're documenting, we're thoughtful, we're putting in the work in advance and hopefully saving ourselves later grief from a risk
Exactly.
management. So
Exactly.
I'm looking at the timer. I go, should we do a couple more questions and leave a few minutes at the end for our newsy items?
Yes, I think that's a great way to wrap up.
I saw a bunch of great questions. Let's see, I'll start with one. I work hard to have a minimal social online presence. However, my patient found an ex-partner's public Facebook profile and found information about me that I would prefer they did not know. Nothing terrible, just pictures of my home life. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations for how to navigate these digital boundaries about patients looking us up online and these boundary violations? That was a great question.
It's interesting because it's more out there and easily accessed these
Okay.
days as opposed to kind of 10, even 10 years ago. And, you know, awesome to have that minimal presence. You can't control everything that folks are going to find, but I'm curious how it came up that they shared this information.
Me
And that might
too.
be where I would lead that conversation is with that curiosity.
Me too. I want to know, like, oh, what does this mean to you? Like, why? And I wouldn't shame, I don't think this person is, but like, it's natural to be curious about someone who you have, professional relationship with. This would be, for me, a moment of informed consent at the beginning of a relationship, because I presume when someone comes in to see me, they've looked me up online to some extent. I hope they've mostly seen things from my professional life. I try to minimize these things, but like, as this person points out, you can do what you can do.
Mhm.
Um, I think that we can put in our informed consent our preferences and say, I prefer to have an in-person relationship, so I'm not going to be Googling you. I invite you to do the same. Now, somebody might have a different perspective on that, and I would respect that. But I'd say it's the type of thing that I want to figure out my own boundaries about, and I'm going to talk about that in informed consent. And if it goes the other direction and someone has found something and they want to talk about something that feels a little more invasive, to share that, like, well, why is that important to know about that facet of my life? You know, again, depending on the nature of the question, the nature, is it intrusive, is it not? That would be a personal choice as the extent to which it is addressed. But I think that the function, the clinical function of it is very interesting. We had another question I thought was a
Yeah.
great one as well. Um, Oops, gosh, I lost it. There's a lot of good ones. In terms of digital boundaries, many of my clients prefer communication via
Mm,
text. I use a HIPAA compliant healthcare communication app. So good. This works 95% of the time. But I do think about easy and immediate access to clinicians and blurring boundaries, such as texting after hours. I'm thinking more and more about how this impact the client and their expectations about versus how it feels for me. Can
mm.
you speak to this issue? I think it's so valuable. Absolutely. This is a perfect example of where our digital availability has blurred boundaries and has benchmarked expectations that may not be aligned with our professional best practices. Again, this to me becomes like an informed consent issue. I want to let folks know this is the timeline on which you can expect a response from me, for a text. This is if there is an emergency, don't send me a text. Much as they say when I log into my primary care for my chart, it says, don't put an emergency here. We're going to get back to you in 3 business days. This is not the place for urgent communication. I like personally in my informed consent, I let folks know this is for admin. This is for I'm running 5 minutes late. This is for what was the homework again? This isn't for, this particular check-in. That's me though. I know many DBT providers use it very differently. So I'm not here to say how you should or shouldn't use it. I'm really saying is we define the boundaries, we benchmark expectations, and we let folks know what we're going to do when it's used the other way. So if you start using it the other way, how am I going to respond? That's the hard moment of holding the boundary, of holding the line.
And I think that's where communicating the quote office hours and when you may or may not respond and what you will do in terms of that conversation and follow up if those lines or boundaries are crossed.
We just have 4 or 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if we
Yeah,
should get into our newsy items.
I think so. And I know we've got lots of questions, so we'll bring those
Yeah.
back and review them for the next session.
Please know we read everyone and we discuss them. So thank you. Thank you for the questions. And but you'll see them again, in future chats. We usually used to do news in the beginning, so we're making a change today, trying it out and we're, you know, leading ourselves out here with news. I think to me, one of the most relevant things that happened in this last 4 month period related to Medicare. There was a question of the renewal of Medicare telehealth flexibility waivers, and that was right around the beginning of the year. And I'll say the good news is, and this is a little confusing, but for now, no meaningful changes. They were extended. It was a little confusing because the expiration date was set during a partial governmental shutdown that resulted in, excuse me, during the governmental shutdown, wherein we couldn't say yay or nay if it was happening. So I think it was a confusing, kind of stressful period of time. Um, the things that are notable, the question was, whether or not an in-person initial visit would be required for new patients. That's kind of one of the big themes. There were several things, many things, but one of them was up for grabs. For now, the status quo has been maintained. That's been the case since the pandemic, which no, that's not required before having an initial appointment. So a few other things were announced at the beginning of the year, including that Medicare is increasing telehealth reimbursements for many services. So that's nice news. Again, this is Medicare only, allowing supervision of students, continuing to allow that. This is good news for telehealth. My takeaway from this, and again, if you don't accept Medicare, this may not relate directly to your practice. I do think it's interesting though, because as Medicare goes, often so goes our nation. As Medicare goes, other private insurance tend to follow their lead. So it's interesting. They're increasing reimbursement. That's interesting. They are having an opinion about initial in-person meetings. That's interesting. If I had a Medicare only practice or a practice that was so substantially populated with Medicare specific patients, I would note that these telehealth I'm gonna try that word again, flexibilities have been extended through January 1st, 2028. I would have some curiosity around, do I want to have a plan B?
Mhm.
If the day ever comes, they've been wildly popular. And I'll share as an individual, it's my expectation we'll continue to see permissions for allowing people to see Medicare patients without an initial in-person visit. That's just an opinion. The truth is we need to wait and find out what happens with the law. If I were in a Medicare only practice and it were possible, I would be thinking about like, well, gosh, what if they did change the law? What would I do? Not that I'm going to start doing it today, not that, that's a foregone conclusion. I personally would just like to have a backup plan. I know it's stressful to talk about these themes, and I always worry. I hope I represent everything crisply and clearly. But all I'm saying is if you had a practice with a great number of Medicare telehealth patients, and this is like a meaningful cornerstone of what you do, I would give some thought. Again, this is extended for some time, but I would give some thought as to what I wanted to do in a circumstance if indeed I did need to give initial assessments in person before engaging telehealth. How would I manage that, and how would I think about that?
Well, Sarah, we've got a little time just quickly to cover that SIPAC has pending legislation in new states. So there's pending legislation in Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York, Iowa, Alaska, and Louisiana.
Louisiana. Who knows? We don't know if it's going to end up passing the
Right.
legislation, but pending legislation is good news for SIPAC proponents. We'll take it. We'll keep an eye on it and update you on these chats if indeed these become SIPAC member
And
states.
last week, I came across a really amazing website that was too late to get into the materials. I know the trust will update it, but they'll drop this website into the chat right now. And it is the ASPPBcenter.org, and it's spelled with the Canadian version of center.
Ventura.
Um, on this site, you can look up your jurisdiction. You can look up other jurisdictions. You can find out how many CEs you need in the year and when the renewal cycles are and what the application for licensure requires. And in a really lovely capstone website, there's some other things you can look around aside from the snapshot, but I encourage everybody to go click on that and have a peek at what information's out there about all the different jurisdictions. And I know we need to wrap up quick. So, Sarah, over to you for the quick summary, and then I will close us out.
Great. Well, thanks, Margot. Thanks so much to you for being here. Thanks to the Trust for having us. Today in our chat, we talked about this new format that we're trying out. Interested to see what folks think. And really, today's focus was on clinical etiquette and how to stay engaged in a digital environment. Norms are changing. How do we greet that moment? What are the little clinical micro skills that help facilitate that? And how do we maintain digital boundaries with our patients in a ways that feel flexible but fundamentally ethical?